Good morning, everyone. I am really happy to have Bob Knakal here, all the way from New York. I would say the largest New York real estate multifamily broker that I know of. And we would love to really hear your insight, how you got into real estate, specifically brokering versus getting into investing, and then really from there, really touch upon the topics I think a lot of Maryland investors have in them that really want to know more about. So, Bob, go at it. Kind of tell us how you started and what got you into real estate.
All right, well, Yakov, pleasure to be with you today, and nice to chat with all the listeners out there. Yeah, I sell. I've been a broker in New York City for now in year number 41. Sold over 2,300 buildings here. The majority of them have been multifamily, although these days I'm doing a lot of land and redevelopment transactions. But have always been very much on top of our rent regulation system and our rent laws, which have significantly impacted the market. In fact, I would say that today, um, public policy impacts the way the market functions much more so than supply and demand does, believe it or not. So, really interesting what has happened. But I got into real estate completely by accident. As a freshman at the Wharton School in 1981, I looked for a summer job that would look good on my resume and thought that Coldwell Banker was a bank, which is why I walked into the place. They hired me. The only ones hiring college kids for the summer. The investment banks and commercial banks were not. So took the job, loved it, went back my next 2 summers, and then started with CB when I got out of school in 1984. Kind of a very serendipitous path led me to a business that is not only my job, but it's my hobby. So feel very blessed that I stumbled into something that I love so much.
Wow, that is so interesting how, you don't know as much about the industry. You kind of just walk into it and then you take on, I'm assuming back then the splits probably may not be what it is today. So I'm assuming, especially in the beginning, like any broker knows, you're really not making any money. To really stick it out, especially, I remember um, reading, I think maybe something you've written up or a book or something like that, how you started with your partner, I believe. You started a firm together once you left CB, and you ended up like right after starting, I think there was a correction, if not mistaken, the market correction.
Yeah, well, I was at CB and Coldwell Banker was the predecessor company to CBRE, which is now the largest commercial brokerage company in the world. But we left CB in 1988 to form our own company, Massimo Group. And yes, we left in '88. The stock market had crashed in October of '87. 88 was still a good year. But 89, everything slowed to a halt and came to a halt. And it was challenging. And then we went into the savings and loan crisis. And we almost went bankrupt a couple of times, had to use credit cards for a while, had to get a loan, had to do anything we had to do to get by. But it was very, very challenging. And those early years were definitely tough. I think the savings and loan crisis was much worse than the recession in the early 2000s or the GFC or what we're going through now. Mainly because back in those days, the lenders weren't really selling paper at all. They were going through what was a 2 or 3 year foreclosure process in New York, getting title to the assets, and then the Resolution Trust Corporation was formed to help these banks get rid of their bad loans and bad properties. And it was definitely for a while there wasn't a heck of a lot going on in New York, so it was dead challenging times for sure.
It's actually I'm happy that you went straight to that because it's actually something that I really wanted to ask you later on, but I think that now that you brought it up, I find, as a broker, as a real estate agent, we're really here to help owners, right? It's something that I've learned through coaching and when I know just experience. You're really here to help owners. And one of the things I've been struggling with, I would say recently, was looking at, a market that is in a downward trend. Whether it be because just happens to be you're in a state where you're losing jobs and, in general, your population is shrinking, or if it's just in a time of a market where things are not going well. And like you said, you've had years where you had to borrow money and you were really struggling. How do you as a broker now approach an owner and really look out for the best benefit to buy or sell when there's really not much going on, right? There's not a lot of positivity out there.
Yeah, well, you have to, like in all times, you want to look for motivation. Why is somebody selling? If their property is worth $50 million and they want 60 million, very, very unlikely they're going to get it, particularly in a challenging market. But they're one of the good things about New York is that there is so much demand that there always is a market clearing price. So if someone has to sell, they can sell at what that market clearing price is. Now that price, unfortunately, is not what a lot of people would hope that it was, particularly in tough times, similar to what we're going through today. But the market's the market, and it's important to educate folks, particularly in a market where prices are dropping. The longer the property's on the market, the lower the prices that you're going to get. So moving quickly and pricing properties appropriately is very, very important, especially in a market that's heading downward.
Got it. So you're saying that the sellers really just need to be realistic, and I think that from what I'm seeing, at least in my market, I think they're slowly getting there. I'm seeing a lot of interesting trends, especially for you for sure, seeing what happened with Fannie Mae and the fact that they cut out Eastern Union and some other brokers that were giving out loans and whatnot. And I think I'm slowly seeing sellers come to that realization that they need to get rid of these properties and they need to sell it at a discount. And I guess really what you're saying is that they need to just be realistic that it's not worth whatever it was, in 2021. You need to sell it at a steep discount, in some scenarios 20% less, in order for the deal to work. And I guess that's why you could sell it to a buyer, like you're saying. You're able to tell them this is the value, and you're getting it for value. I guess a study case for kind of what I'm referring to is also, let's say in my market, right? Office is dying in downtown Baltimore, and I keep reading in the local news how groups are buying buildings, office buildings, which is not my specialty, but I read it. And 5 years ago they paid, let's say, 20 million, and now the new group that came in is paying 9 million. In my mind, I'm like, why would you buy even for 9 million? If you see, 5 years ago it went down like 50% in value, if not more. Why would you pay for that? And I guess, New York might be different, but I don't know if you had that experience, maybe similar in the New York market, where there's just some industries or some types of real estate that are just doing really bad.
Yeah, well, interestingly, in New York today, different product types are moving in different directions. The retail property market is on the way up. Industrial is still very strong. The hotel market is absolutely on fire. Land values are increasing. But multifamily, because of legislative headwinds, are having a tough time, and refinance risk, which is one of the biggest drivers of non-discretionary sellers in the market today. And then our B and C office stock, we have a ton, tens and tens of millions of square feet of vacant office space. We need apartments. There's some legislative changes in the city that have helped, that it should help to convert a lot of that office space to either residential, or the building's going to be demolished. But it's a tough situation in certain sectors today, especially when if you are maturing off of 3% or 3.5% mortgages. It's going to cost you double today in terms of rate, and you're going to have to put 25 or 35% cash in probably to effectuate that refinancing. And a lot of folks either don't have that capital or will choose not to put that fresh capital into a property that they view as having a questionable future.
So that's a very good point that you're saying, that in scenarios where they need a refinance because let's say if they took out a 5 year, it's coming due and they need a refinance. What do you think is going to happen to those properties if, let's say office wise, right? If it's Class B office, the value is not what it was 4 years ago. Essentially, their loan might be more than the value at this point, depending on how much it dropped. What do you think is going to happen to those properties?
Well, it really depends on the position the lender takes relative to how they want to deal with it. I have a lot of clients that want to simply hand the keys to the property back to the bank, but the bank doesn't want the keys. And so, will the bank cooperate in doing a short sale? Will the property owner negotiate to try to get out of the personal guarantee if they cooperate with a sale and not hold things up for years? Are there things that are going to make the lender behave in one way or another, or are they not? So, those are the things that will drive that decision-making process.
Got it. So that it's very interesting. I mean, to see the hurt, and I feel like we're in such uncharted waters in a sense where I remember going to events in 22 and says, stay alive till 25. And I feel like, we've been alive till 25 and now they're saying till 27. It just feels like it's a very interesting time that we're in. And what would you say is your forecast, seeing everything that's going around you? Um, do you see positivity in the near future for owners that have been holding out this long? What is your outlook?
Well, I think it depends on the sector that you're talking about. I think if you own retail property today or a hotel or a piece of land, I think you can exit at a pretty decent execution. If you have multifamily that's saddled with debt and it's maturing and it's at a low rate, or you have one of these B or C office buildings that has high vacancy, it's going to be tough sledding for a while. So I think it depends on what you own, what your cash reserves are. And I think that 2025 is actually going to be a great year from a transaction volume perspective because you have a bunch of discretionary sellers and non-discretionary sellers looking to make moves at the same time.
Right, right. That makes sense. And I guess really leading into that, it seems that, like you brought up a little bit earlier when it comes to the government regulations, and specifically, I mentioned a little earlier the correlation that I'm seeing in certain areas in my state, in Maryland specifically. You have different counties. You have Montgomery County, you have Prince George's County that are next to DC, and they're adopting some of the policies. And one of the major policies that I've seen affect owners where in 2020 they purchased a property with the idea to do a value add strategy, and then in 2021, 22 they passed this, they passed essentially that you cannot raise it past a certain percentage depending on the CPI and whatever it is. But the point is that what do you tell those owners? I know, like in 2019, New York really started with this. I remember when it passed, and I have friends that own properties, and they were really getting nervous about it. But what are those owners doing since 2019 till today? And is there really anything that could be done to make money with these properties if you just can't raise the rent once your tenant moves out?
Yeah, I think you have to have a very long-term perspective. I think you also have to figure out how to most economically do the minimum in terms of renovations. One of the byproducts of this legislation that really hurts the market is that the quality of the housing stock is deteriorating because there's no incentive for the private sector to invest in the housing stock. So let me give you one example. We'll go back to 1978. Yankees and Dodgers are in the World Series, and the Goodyear blimp is above Yankee Stadium, and it pans out. There are six fires going on within 3 blocks of Yankee Stadium. And it was at that time, it was um, uh, it was that people had no incentive to invest in their property. Yakov, excuse me, I have to shut something off one second. Okay. All right.
Don't worry, I have an editing team, so they'll be able to edit it out, so don't worry about it.
All right. So we'll go back to 1978. Yankees and Dodgers playing in the World Series. Reggie's hitting all the home runs. Goodyear blimp is over Yankee Stadium, pans out. There are six fires going on within 3 blocks of Yankee Stadium. And the famous announcer, Howard Cosell, says, the Bronx is burning. Well, why was the Bronx burning? The Bronx was burning because it made more sense for people to burn their properties down than to invest in them. And so the city very wisely came up with two programs, the Major Capital Improvement Program, MCI, which gave rent increases for building-wide improvements, new roof, new lobby, new stairway, new windows, new heating plant. And then there was the second program was the IAI program, the Individual Apartment Improvement Program. Put in a new kitchen, a new bathroom, new sheetrock, new flooring, new electricity. You did things to the apartment, you got to pass those increases along to the tenants as well. 1978, New York City had a 14% dilapidation rate, meaning that 14% of the apartments were in such crummy condition, they were deemed uninhabitable. By 2019, because of these two programs that incentivized the private sector to invest in the housing stock, you had tens of billions of dollars of equity invested in housing in New York, and that dilapidation rate dropped from 14% to 0.04%.
Wow.
In the rent law changes in 2019, both of these programs were neutered, basically, killing the incentive for the private sector to invest in housing. So, a lot of these apartments that have been occupied by rent stabilized or rent controlled tenants for a long, long time, require $150,000 of renovation to make them in good condition for a new tenant. But if you can only increase the rent by $50 a month, who on earth is going to invest $150,000 to make $50 a month? It doesn't make any sense. So consequently, you have a disincentive to invest in housing. You can't extract value from rent stabilized apartments. It used to be you could only have a rent stabilized apartment if it was your primary residence or you were not illegally subletting it. And today, people, are living outside the city and use their rent stabilized apartment as a crash pad, which constricts supply and exerts upward pressure on rents. Some people are making a business out of it, and they have a $700 a month apartment that they're paying $700 for, and they're renting it out for $4,000. But it makes absolutely zero sense for the owner to try to get those tenants out, because if you get the tenant out, you're only going to get a very small increase on the $700 rent. So there's no incentive for that. So there is a complete misallocation of the housing stock in New York, because these laws seek to confiscate private property and tell private owners what they can do with their property, as opposed to just incentivizing more stock. And the hypocritical thing is that every policymaker in New York will say, we want New York to be more affordable for everyone. We want rents to be lower. We want everybody to be able to afford to live here. Yet every single piece of legislation until recently, every single piece of legislation that was either passed or ignored since 2018 has done nothing but constricted supply and exerted upward pressure on rents, making New York less affordable for everybody. So now we just recently, December 6th, we had legislation called City of Yes pass, which has created some incentives to build new housing. But the solution to all of New York City's housing woes, and probably the housing woes in a lot of places, is by adding supply. Look, during the pandemic, we had a lot of people not renew leases. They moved out to the suburbs. Kids moved back into mom and dad's house, and our vacancy rose significantly. Rents in Manhattan in 2020 dropped by 30%.
Wow.
Because effectively all this vacancy was like adding to supply. Rents dropped 30%. There is not a housing policy initiative implemented anywhere in the United States that caused rents to go down by 10%, let alone 30%. So all we need is more supply. And if we don't have those incentives to create the supply, it's going to be very, very difficult to make New York more affordable for everybody.
Right. It's very interesting that what you're talking about specifically when it comes to older housing. So it's really two follow-up questions, and I think we could just go at one at a time. So since 2019, it's not like the more recent challenges that I'm seeing in my market. 2019 at this point, it's long enough to have a case study on what owners did. What, practically speaking, have owners done since 2019 that have these buildings? Do they hand the keys back to the bank if they can't raise the rent and they have high debt?
Look, what has happened is that unit that was renting for $700 a month, that's worth $4,000 a month, but you can't charge $4,000 a month. You're not going to renovate it. Tenant leaves, owners are nailing the door shut. Um, and that's really the only solution. Very, very few people are renting that apartment for $758 or whatever you could charge today, because you're essentially giving a life estate to the person who's going to move in there. So we have tens of thousands of apartments that are vacant, further constricting supply, adding to the upward pressure on rents. And it's a challenge. Many of the folks who, it's very interesting in the multifamily market in New York. For decades, I had clients who would only buy apartment buildings in New York City. They wouldn't go to Westchester or New Jersey or Long Island, just New York City. And since the HSTPA passed in 2019, I would say 85 to 90% of them won't buy an apartment building in New York anymore. They're buying outside New York. They're buying in Florida and Texas and Tennessee and Arizona. And what's happening is folks are coming in to New York to buy buildings that not really understanding the market. And that's not really good for the city. And it's creating issues, and they're going to be issues down the line.
Right, right. So it seems like you're saying it's really ongoing, and whoever was fortunate enough to buy it a real long time ago at least can make some money out of it, even if they're just keeping it at lower rents. But really, the investors that may have bought in 2018, and those are the ones that are really stuck holding the bag when it comes to refining, when it comes to anything else, because they're probably not hitting the DSCR requirements if they're going to be, locking up all those units because they can re-rent them. And I can imagine that that would put a lot of pressure on the market. And, really getting into what you were just saying, also specifically construction. I grew up in Brooklyn, and I remember whenever I come visit home, I walk down the street and I see these tiny, very, very thin, narrow buildings, like 8 stories up, all over, the Flatbush area of where I grew up. I know you mentioned specifically construction. I don't know much about the New York market, but I have seen a lot of construction that's just been sitting for, I would say, almost years, mid renovation. I know specifically you mentioned adding supply to the market. What challenges are you seeing, especially if you think about going forward with the tariffs? And, I'm not sure what your opinion is on that, but putting that all together, what challenges are you seeing now and in the near future for specifically construction?
Well, it depends. In the Manhattan market, and I sell a lot of development sites in Manhattan, everybody's building condo. Because we have a tax abatement program here. We had for many, many years, we had what was called the 421A tax abatement to build new buildings. And just because the cost of construction is so expensive here, that you need a tax abatement in order to make the deal feasible. The 421A tax abatement sunsetted. A couple of years later, they brought back a new form of that tax abatement program. It was called Affordable New York. And that was a watered down 421A. And today we have what's called 485X, which is a watered down Affordable New York. And it's not workable. I don't know anybody we have 3 zones, basically. Zone A, which is prime Manhattan and a few prime pockets in Brooklyn and Queens. Zone B, which is the secondary type of markets, and then the rest of the city. And there are minimum wage requirements tied to this tax abatement such that it doesn't work. I don't, if you build over 100 units, you in Manhattan in Zone A, you have to pay $72.45 as a minimum wage. You can't pay the person standing in the street with the stop sign $72.45 and make the building feasible. So I don't know a single developer that's going to build under the program. And even outside that area, where you have land values that might be 150 or $200 a buildable foot, your minimum wage for a building over 99 units is $40 an hour. And what developers are telling me is that minimum wage increases hard costs of construction by $75 to $100. So you're in a market where the land value is 150 to 200 and your costs are going up by 75 to 100, doesn't leave a lot for land value. And politicians will say, well, the seller of the land just has to take less. Well, you know what? There's no law saying people have to sell. So if they're not motivated to sell, and that's why rezonings typically produce a lot of activity because land value goes up and the seller says, wow, my site was worth 20 million, now it's worth 30 million. I'm going to sell it. And so they sell it and you get 100 or 200 new units of housing, and that's good for the city, it's good for the union, it's good for everybody. But if your land value goes from 20 million to 10 million, nobody's going to sell. They'll wait for the value to get better. So what do you get? You get a lot of nothing. So, you make the minimum wage $40 an hour. Why not make it $140 an hour or $240 an hour? If nobody's going to be getting paid that wage, what's the difference?
Right, right. So it's interesting. Really, seemingly, kind of what we're seeing in our market. Essentially, if the politics doesn't change and if it continues going down the path that it is going down, it's just going to get worse. Is essentially, from what I hear, is what you're saying.
The problem is that what is really going on is the politicians just don't want new supply in their districts. And I'll give you a story. When Elliot Spitzer was the mayor, or was the governor of New York, um, the area around what is now Barclays Center in Atlantic Yards was being rezoned, and there were proposals to rezone it, build 9,000 apartments, 25% of which would have been affordable, and the local council person voted against it. So Elliot called that council person into his office and said to her, how could you vote against this? This is going to bring, 25% of these 9,000 apartments are going to be affordable. Why would you not want that in your district? And she said, Governor, if we build 9,000 apartments in my district, that may bring 20,000 people into my district that don't know me and might not vote for me. That's the reality. That's the unfortunate reality. So we have to have elected officials that think about the best interests of their constituents instead of their best interest. Because I'm telling you, like I said earlier, public policy impacts the way our multifamily market functions much more so than supply and demand does, which is really remarkable to think about.
It is very interesting because even like I remember learning about a lot of the I guess you could say corrections that have happened in the past, and some of them had very much to do with the policies that were going on at the time. Whether the federal, whether the federal government was pushing to create more housing, and then that created issues. And like you said, even post every time there's a correction, they try to fix it, but then that issue becomes into the next crash. Essentially, is from what I learned. So what are you doing to educate your owners really to be able to have them succeed in scenarios where it's very tough? I know, from what I understand, you focus on developments and, multifamily. So how are you educating your owners to help them succeed?
Well, we're just trying to make them aware of the things that create value. I mean, the reality is in the multifamily business today and subsequent to June of 2019, when these new laws passed, the owner of an apartment building is not selling the building. They're not selling their bricks and mortar and windows and doors. They're selling the boxes of paperwork they have in their office. Because if the paperwork is not in good shape, no matter what condition the building's in, you're not going to get a good price. So you have to keep impeccable records. You have to make sure you register everything properly, and you have to understand what creates value. Fixing a broken window doesn't create value as much as keeping a record of how you fixed it, who you paid, who you hired, the contract you had, the canceled check. All of that stuff is much more important than actually fixing the condition that is adverse.
Right, right. It's interesting because I know also, for example, in Montgomery County, which is one of the local counties in Maryland, they have rent stabilization for years. I think going back to the 70s, post-war, they really pushed rent stabilization to Como Park City. And I was working on a property there where essentially they have I don't know if they have this in New York, the concept of banked rents. So essentially what happens is that if let's say you have a tenant that's there and they're paying $800 a month, but technically speaking, you're able to raise the rent by, let's say, 3% this year, but they're in the unit. So what they have is this banked rents, which is basically this artificial rent as if you raise that rent by 3% that year. So when it comes time for them to move out 5 years later, obviously you're not going to be able to raise it to where maybe the market is at, but you're able to, throughout those years, raise it by 3% each year. So now by the time they leave, it's essentially going to be whatever amount of years times that 3%, whatever the percentage was per year. And now you could raise the rent by that amount in order for you to succeed. Now, like you're saying, if your property's in great condition, but you never filed for those banked rents, you're getting 3% above 800. Have you done the proper paperwork? Now it might have gone to 1,000 or 1,100. So I guess I really see what you're saying there. It really brings out a point where we're playing a different game, right? It's not the game of quality, it's the game of surviving through politics that are really made to keep people in power by showing, hey, we are able to keep your rents lower because we passed rent stabilization. 3 years later, they're out, they're living in wherever they're living with a beautiful house, and then all the owners are the ones that get the bad end of the stick.
Yeah, look, what has happened is that they've changed the nature of owning these apartment buildings very significantly. I have one owner, he's been a client for 40 years. He owns thousands of apartments. And he said to me the other day, he says, Bob, today I'm nothing more than a janitor. I'm just a janitor trying to keep my buildings as in as good a shape as I can for what I can afford to pay to maintain them. I can't afford to pay a lot because even with not spending a lot um, on the maintenance, my expenses are still going up at a much higher rate than my rents are going up. So this is a losing proposition. And what's the right cap rate on a building? If a building's 100% rent stabilized in New York, your NOI is dropping every year. What's the right cap rate for a cash flow that decreases year after year after year?
Yeah, 100%. It's funny you're saying that because I was at an event. I'm sure you're familiar with BizNow.
Yep.
So I was at a BizNow event where it's right after they passed rent stabilization in PG County, which is one of the counties here. There's an owner that got up and he basically said, I didn't see it work in New York. What are you guys doing? And all the politicians that were involved were on stage. BizNow brought them down. And I'm like, you know what, this guy, he got up in the middle of the event, he made a whole scene and everything. So I went to him after directly and I said, hey, talk to me. What's going on with your properties? And he told me. He made a calculation by 10 years from now, he's going to be losing money just because expenses are going up by X, rent's going up by X. Like you're saying, it's only a matter of time where it just doesn't make any sense anymore. And he can't even sell it anymore. So that is the challenge. And it really, I guess it's just pushing in better politics. I don't know, from our conversation, I don't know if there's anything else aside from just better politics, really.
Well, it's education. It's educating. I think a lot of our policymakers really don't understand the impact that economics have. I mean, price controls, price fixing has never created and never done anything good. It's led to shortages. It's led to misallocation of resources. It's just a terrible thing. So, if you just understood that, hey, if we incentivize building of more units, rents are going to go down. Actually, and politicians in New York dislike real estate people so much they won't even take campaign contributions from them. But the insane thing is that actually by implementing these misguided policies, they're actually making the people that they hate, these real estate owners, wealthier because the free market rents that they get in the building are artificially high because there are many fewer choices a tenant has in terms of where to live. If they created more supply, they'd actually be reducing the net worth that people have who own free market buildings. But they don't look at it closely enough to see that that's the fact.
And it actually, right when you said that, it just hit everything you were saying all tied into one, which is if landowners' value went down, they're not going to sell, so you can't develop. If you have an older building, you're not renting out new units. If you have a building that's free market, you're a limited supply because there's not a lot of development competition. And that leads exactly to what you said. There's just high rents everywhere because wherever you could get high rent, you're charging crazy rents. And whenever you can't, there's no more units going on the market because they don't want to rent it. And that's going to be interesting. Have you seen, I mean, you've been through quite a bit of ups and downs in the real estate market. Have you seen a scenario in the past where politicians went too far on something and then over time they actually went back? Is there a specific example that you see?
Yeah, well, I think we're seeing it right now, actually, in that this 485X tax abatement that I mentioned is pretty useless if you're building 100 units or more. I think that the policymakers have sufficient egg on their face that it has induced them to make another rezoning much more usable and likely to succeed, and that's the Midtown South rezoning, which is pending, and it was going to increase density from. We have something called the floor area ratio that tells you for every square foot of land you have, how many square feet of building you could have. They wanted to incentivize people to demolish older, functionally obsolete buildings, particularly in the garment center. And they were going to change the density in the FAR from 10 to 12. But because 485X was such a debacle, they didn't want to have two clunkers in a row. So they changed it from 10 to 12 to 10 to 18. And that, if it passes, is likely to produce a lot of good results that will really help the city and ultimately drive rents down. But it takes, I guess, embarrassment to get folks to do the right thing.
Interesting, interesting. I see exactly what you're saying there. It's interesting to hear from the back end of kind of what's going on. What and really kind of coming along those lines, what brought people back to New York post the COVID flight to Florida and to wherever? What brought people back? If this is the even just investment wise, I was listening to like Equity Residential, and they're saying how their East Coast properties are doing amazing, and actually north is specifically in the north, right? They're doing great in Boston, in New York. I think is their top performing market. What is bringing people back to New York based on everything that's going on?
Yeah, well, our occupancies are high. People do want to come live and work here. Employers are requesting that their folks come back to work. And I think a lot of people just want to live in New York. Look, I think New York is the greatest city in the world. No disrespect to Baltimore, but we have so many things going for us. The talent pool is amazing. The culture, the restaurants, the nightlife, the sporting events. There are so many great things about New York that attract people. And if we would only do more to make the city more affordable for everybody, like every politician says that they want, we'd have a lot more people coming to New York. So, um, it really is unfortunate that these folks think that just by constricting what a private owner can do with their own property is a better housing policy than just creating more units.
Uh, As you're saying that, actually, it brought up another question, which is why do you think New York is so much more outperforming California when you look at both jobs that are leaving? I think California is having a lot larger struggle, housing, when I think a lot of the policies are very similar. Do you, in your mind, do you see something that's specifically different why New York's actually doing better versus California?
I don't know very much about the California market. I just my whole career I focused just on New York, so I really don't know much about what's happening around the country.
I hear that. I definitely hear that. And I guess that's, that's really what you teach, which is, and you teach what you preach, right? So you got to make sure you know your market and really be able to help owners with that. Just in a conversation, you know exactly what's going on, which laws and which things they tried to pass to help and bring it along. Um, Kind of going on a different note here, what are, inspirations that you take, books that you find to be helpful to really continue going and help you through tough times. Like you said, they were very, very tough years.
Well, I think there are a lot of very inspirational and thought-provoking books out there. I like to read about persuasion and psychology and human behavior and selling, and just trying to figure out why people do what they do. And in fact, I have if you go to bobknakal.com, you can see a suggested reading list I have. A lot of great books on there. Jim Collins' Good to Great, the series by Dr. Benjamin Hardy and Dan Sullivan. They wrote three great books. They've written so far three, probably more on the way, that are fantastic. Bill Urey, The Power of a Positive No, Keith Ferrazzi, Never Eat Alone. Those are so many great books. I can go on and on and on, but those are really, really enjoyable, and the whole list is on my website.
I'm gonna check it out. I'm gonna have those audiobooks going while I go and canvas properties. Bob, thank you so much. Is there any questions you have for me? I know everyone asks you so many questions because of your knowledge. I just figured, hey, any questions you have for me about anything?
No, just, if folks want to reach out to me with questions, they can feel free to email me at bk@bkrea.com, or go to one of the websites. I have bkrea.com and bobknakal.com. I'm also active on social media, so feel free to DM me. I look forward to interacting with folks, and glad I had a chance to be with you today, Jaco.
Bob, thank you so much. I hope you have a good one.